Go. Hello, everyone. My name's Renee Davies. I'm a trip specialist at a company called Nomad Adventures. Welcome to our presentation, Machu Picchu and Beyond, Practical Advice for Traveling in Peru. So a little bit just about Nomad and who we are. We do all private custom travel. So what that means is I work with you and your own group of travelers. So sometimes that's couples, sometimes it's a group of friends, sometimes it's a family. We do a few special interest groups as well. But I work with you to design your own trip that's tailored to your own interests. So that's how active you like to be, the types of activities you enjoy, how long you have to travel, your budget, the types of hotels you like, really everything under the sun to design a trip that's perfect for you. And then once you arrive, you have all local guides, drivers, transportation's taken care of, really everything's taken care of for you so you can just enjoy the trip. We are a regional specialist. We only do South America, really. Within that, our focus is Peru, Ecuador, with Ecuador, a large part of that is the Galapagos, Chile, Argentina, a large part of what we do in Chile and Argentina is Patagonia. And then we do Antarctica as well, a little bit of Brazil, and we've just expanded to Colombia too. A little bit just kind of about our process and how it works. The first step in our process we call a discovery, which is just a usually 20-minute to sometimes hour-long phone call for us to learn more about you, learn kind of some of those interests and what would make a good trip for you, make suggestions, do a lot of education on the destination where you're looking at going. And then from there, we can send over a trip skeleton, which is just a high level overview of the trip we're recommending, a day 1 here, day 2 here, day 3 here with a ballpark for that trip. And then we put together a full detailed proposal with your exact trip cost, detailed descriptions of each day before you confirm. So that's just a little bit about us. If you're interested in learning more, you can check out our website. It's again, Nomad Adventures, and that's our website is nomadadventures.com. That's KNOWMAD. But with that, I'm gonna dive into Peru, the reason you guys are here. So here you can see Peru is a pretty big country. It's just south of Ecuador and north of Chile. I really kind of, with Peru, it's kind of, I feel like everything you would want in a travel destination. You have stunning landscapes, you have a variety of different activities you can do. There's some of the most amazing hiking in the world. You can do biking, kayaking, horseback riding. There's really fascinating history, diverse cultures. The people are so friendly. It's some of the most amazing food, not only in South America, but Lima has 2 of the top 10 restaurants in the world. So it really has kind of everything you would look for in a travel destination. Looking at the country, these are kind of the most common regions here that travelers go to. Flying from the States, you're gonna fly into Lima. Most flights from the US, especially if you're flying from Minneapolis, most flights arrive in Lima late at night. So usually what works well that day is just kind of, there's an airport hotel there, the Wyndham, that's just right across the street. And that works well to connect the next day on a flight to Cusco if you're not spending any time in Lima. If you are spending time in Lima, then you can kind of head into Lima. Then Cusco, this is where kind of this area is where most people's trips are focused. Near Cusco, you have Machu. So here's Cusco and here's Machu Picchu. I'm not sure if you guys can see my mouse there. And then the whole region between Cusco and Machu Picchu is the Sacred Valley. We'll talk about all these regions more in depth. And then you have Puerto Maldonado, which is a city in the southern Amazon basin. So this is one area where you can access the Amazon jungle. It's important to note it's not the Amazon River, it's the Amazon jungle. If it's really important to you that your Amazon experience take you to the Amazon River, then you're gonna need to go to northern Peru, flying into a city called Iquitos and do an Amazon River cruise is one of the options. There are also lodges, but do a trip up there. It does take more time to get to. It is generally more expensive. So for people just looking for a little bit of an Amazon experience, Puerto Maldonado works great. It's just about an hour flight from Cusco. And then you also have Lake Titicaca, another great extension to a Machu Picchu trip. Again, just about an hour flight or so. Lake Titicaca is the highest navigable lake in the world. And it's a great cultural extension. You have some really interesting cultures there, and I'll show you some more of those later. And then you have Arequipa, and near Arequipa, you also have the Colca Canyon, which I will talk about. So those are kind of some of the main areas where people go in Peru. Like I said, if you're flying from the US, you're likely going to fly into Lima. It's not a very common combo, but if you are combining Peru with the Chile trip, there are a few days a week a direct flight from Santiago to Cusco. So if that's a combo that you're interested in, which would require at least 2 weeks to properly combine those two destinations, try and time the day you fly between those two countries, one of the days where you have that direct Santiago to Cusco flight, and you cut a flight out of the way, right? But diving into it a little bit more. So this, like I said, is really the focus of most people's trips, the kind of Southern Highlands region where you have Machu Picchu, the Sacred Valley, the Inca Trail, which we'll talk about, Cusco, Lake Titicaca, Puerto Maldonado. I'm not going to dive too much into history, but one thing I always like to point out that I think is fascinating is that the Incan Empire actually lasted less than 100 years. You have a much longer history of these pre-Incan civilizations, but you'll see in Peru, the Incans left such an impact on today's culture, holidays, food, the architecture there, but it was actually a really kind of short time period when you think about everything that came before it and how long the Spanish were there before independence as well. All right. So kind of diving into those different regions, like I said, you'll fly into Lima that first night. If you want to spend time in Lima, you can do it on the front end or the back end. Generally, I like it actually more on the back end of a trip. It works as a nice buffer between a connecting flight and what's then an overnight flight home. But it has advantages on both ends. I would say 70% of our travelers actually don't spend any time in Lima. For most, it's not as much of a highlight city as Buenos Aires, for example. It is a very cosmopolitan city. The reasons I would add time there are if you are at all a foodie. Like I said, Lima has 2 of the best restaurants in the world. They are ones that require reservations months in advance, and they're tasting menus that are, close to the kind of $200 range, but there's just incredible restaurants all over Lima. So if you're a foodie, I'd suggest considering spending time there. Or if you really enjoy museums, the Larco Museum is fantastic there. It's a museum that has a bunch of pre-Columbian artifacts and really talks about all those pre-Incan periods as well. But then moving on from Lima, you're going to fly from Lima to Cusco. One of the biggest mistakes people make when they plan their trip, and a lot of companies I see make it too, planning a trip to Peru, is to have you land in Cusco and then stay in Cusco. Some even think, well, I'll have you stay in Cusco and acclimatize for Machu Picchu. Where actually it's really the opposite. Cusco's, on most trips, it's going to be the highest destination where you're going to be sleeping. It's at about 11,000 feet, which is just really too high for most people to properly acclimatize. You're much more likely to have side effects from altitude sickness, not sleep well, not feel very good those first few days, or have some more severe side effects as well. So I highly recommend flying to Cusco, but then pretty much head straight down to the Sacred Valley. These photos here you see are from the Sacred Valley, which is at about 9,000 feet. So it's high enough you're definitely acclimatizing, you're definitely likely to feel it, but most people don't have as many side effects from altitude sickness in the Sacred Valley as you would in Cusco. It's also it's my personal favorite area of Peru. It's absolutely gorgeous. It's a great area to do some more off the beaten path hikes, to do mountain biking, to do horseback riding, to do kayaking, do all those kind of multi-sport activities I talked about. Really connect with indigenous cultures there as well. There's great markets you can go to, some really neat off the beaten path ruin sites. Certainly Machu Picchu is the most famous, but there are ruins and Inca Trail actually scattered all over the country. So in the Sacred Valley area, you have Maras, Morai, and Pisac, which are 3 really great sites that I'll kind of show some photos of later as well. So I highly recommend starting your trip off here. I would suggest a minimum of 2 nights, but ideally 3 to 4 nights. And then if you are someone who really likes to have some more downtime, you want kind of a full day at leisure to just kind of poke around town and explore on your own. I've had travelers stay 5 nights or more in the Sacred Valley and love it. And this, sorry, the Sacred Valley, if I didn't make it clear, it's a whole region between Cusco and Machu Picchu. So driving from Cusco to Ollantaytambo is kind of the last town in the Sacred Valley, where you then, a lot of people from there, you can from Cusco as well, but take the train from there to Machu Picchu. So that whole region between kind of Cusco and Ollantaytambo is the Sacred Valley. All right, so then after your time in the Sacred Valley, you're feeling acclimatized, you've done some really great activities there. Then I suggest heading onward to Machu Picchu. Again, Machu Picchu is actually lower than the Sacred Valley. It's at about 8,000 feet. But I still do recommend doing the Sacred Valley first because you really want to be acclimatized so you can enjoy your time at Machu Picchu the fullest. And there are a lot of stairs within the site. So you want to be a little bit more acclimatized when then you go to tackle those. So this is Machu Picchu. You can take a train from Cusco. With the kind of trip I've laid out, you're going to be taking a train from the Sacred Valley, generally from Ollantaytambo to Machu Picchu. You're actually taking it to the town right below Machu Picchu, which is called Aguas Calientes. And then it's a short, about 20-minute bus ride up from there to the site. I highly recommend for most people staying in Aguas Calientes, either the night before your visit to Machu Picchu or the night after, or both of them if you want to get a true full day at the site. A lot of travelers do day trips to the site, which for some is a fit, but for most, you're left with just kind of a short window at the site and you have a train time you have to meet. So I really suggest staying 1 or 2 nights in Aguas Calientes, that town below Machu Picchu. Another important thing to think about with Machu Picchu for a lot of probably this crowd with being the expo and more active travelers is if you want to do one of the permitted hikes within the site. Those are Huayna Picchu, which is where you can climb up to this main peak here, climbing up to Huayna Picchu and you get a bird's eye view of the site, or climbing Cerro Machu Picchu, which is opposite of this mountain. Huayna Picchu is a very steep hike. It's not for those with a fear of heights. It's about, I'd say, an hour or so up and then spending time there, and then it is an hour or so down because the down can take time with it being kind of so steep and having to go down very cautiously. But you do need permits. Those permits generally sell out a month, 2 months, could be even 3 months during high season in advance. One thing to note, if anyone out there is looking at trips in 2020, and we'll talk about kind of where Peru's at with COVID restrictions right now. Currently, Huayna Picchu and Cerro Machu Picchu, those hikes are not operating, or sorry, for 2021. Those hikes haven't been announced yet that they're going to operate. Maybe they will, but currently they're not doing permits for those. The other option of how to get to Machu Picchu is, of course, the Inca Trail. Again, being the expo, my guess is a lot of you guys are interested in kind of possibly some of the hiking options to Machu Picchu. The only hike that truly takes you into Machu Picchu, where you arrive to the Sun Gate, which is the way the Incans arrived, is doing the Inca Trail. There are 2 ways, however, to do the Inca Trail. The full kind of Inca Trail trek that's the most common is where you have 4 days of hiking, and then you arrive to Machu Picchu. I would say 90% of companies do that as where you have 3 full days of hiking, and then on the 4th day, you wake up before dawn while it's still dark out to do this kind of rush to the site to get there for the sunrise. I don't recommend doing it that way. It means you're going a pretty quick pace for the rest of the hike. It also puts you at the same pace as, like I said, about 90% of other travel groups using similar campsites. generally it's 500 permits a day for people to start the Inca Trail. So it puts you there with a lot of that pack doing it that way. And then it also means you're arriving to the site actually when a lot of people do rush there to get it, and you're exhausted from just having this trek. You do a short visit at the site and then leave. So I really highly recommend the way we do it, which is 4 full days of hiking. On that 4th day, you arrive to Machu Picchu in the late afternoon, which is when the site's actually really clearing out from visitors. It's a much more magical time to see the site for the first time. It's often when the light is best as well. And then my favorite part of doing it this way is it actually means you're at a different point of the trail than most of the other travelers. We actually, the way we do it, the first day we have you hiking on the other side of the river. So that first day you see hardly anyone else at all. We have a private campsite that evening, which is the one shown here actually in the bottom right-hand corner and is below kind of a ruined site up in the mountains there. So you see hardly anyone that day. Second day again, you see hardly anyone. The third day is when you do start running into more groups and start seeing a few more travelers. And then the 4th day you definitely do. But it's just a much more peaceful way, I would say, to do what is really an amazing hike. So I'd highly recommend that if you're thinking of doing the Inca Trail. Again, you arrive in the late afternoon on that 4th day, and then we take you see the site, walk through it, but then take you down to that town Aguascalientes to spend the evening there. You get a good night's rest, showered, go back up to the site, refreshed the next day, energized to then do a full tour of the site, do one of those optional hikes within the site if you'd like to. We generally buy everyone permits for those by default. And then you're, like I said, energized to really enjoy Machu Picchu that next day. So I highly recommend doing it that way if you're thinking of the full Inca Trail. If you are interested in the Inca Trail, you don't have time for it though, you aren't quite sure if you're up for 4 days of trekking and 3 nights of camping, the Inca Trail Express is a really awesome option. It's just the 4th day of the Inca Trail. So what you'll do is you take a train, and I think I maybe have a photo here. Yeah, so this is a map of the Inca Trail. You take the train in and then you get off at kilometer 104 and you start hiking there. So you get off the train before it arrives to Aguascalientes, and you basically get off similar to here, hike up, and then join the Inca Trail and hike the final day of the Inca Trail. It is still a difficult full day hike. For most people, it takes, I'd say that the Inca Trail Express takes most people 4 to 6 hours. But being still a difficult hike, you feel like you earned it. It doesn't take up 4 days of your trip. So you can do some more stuff as well. And then for those who aren't quite sure they're up for a full trek, it's a really great way to get that experience of hiking to Machu Picchu. So this just is a glance at the full Inca Trail trek. This is the way that we do it. Companies vary in the campsites they use. We're at different campsites, not only because we're on a different kind of pacing as a lot of other companies, but also we meet some very strict environmental restrictions that allow us to use these campsites. This one particularly actually is just a private campsite we use. But as you can see, the way we do it, the first day is pretty relatively easy, but don't get too confident, I'd say, that day. It's really important on the Inca Trail to pace. Looks like it's just up, 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 but a lot of the Inca Trail actually within this is up, down, and a lot of it is stairs as well, which I have a photo later on of kind of showing what some of the paths look like, but you're hiking on stones and then Incan steps a lot as well. But you're hiking up, up, up this day, camp here, and then finish the pass here. This means Dead Woman's Pass. You reach that altitude of close to 14,000 feet and then hike down and then up and then down and then up to your third camp. This is the most difficult day, the way we do it. Here it says average 6 to 7 hours of hiking per day. I would say that's true for the other 3 days. This day ends up being more 8 to 10 for most people. It is a very full day of hiking. And this part, especially the down and then up, is very difficult. And then the 4th day is a bit easier and kind of downhill until you then arrive to the Sun Gate for your first views of Machu Picchu, and then down to the site. And I forgot to mention at the beginning, but we'll have time for questions at the end. The way I'm doing this, I can't really see the questions at the same time as I'm doing the presentation. So I'm not sure if there have been any questions yet, but we'll see them at the end, and I can certainly answer any questions people may have about the Inca Trail or anything else. So then after you've done the Sacred Valley, Machu Picchu, whether that involves the Inca Trail or whether it doesn't, like I said, you don't have to do the Inca Trail. You can certainly just train there and then bus up to the site. Then end that portion of your trip in Cusco. Cusco is a really cool city. It's one of my favorite cities in South America. It's kind of where it all comes together. You can see all these different time periods of Peru represented in its buildings. A lot of the buildings have the Incan stonework, and then you can see where the Spaniards arrived and just built on top of that. And then now they have all these modern fixtures and amenities. So it's a really fascinating city. Food is great there as well. It's also really easy to navigate. So if you're someone that doesn't like to be too guided, it's a great spot to just kind of enjoy the city at leisure, but do it at the end of your trip. It's, like I said, 11,000 feet. So you really want to be better acclimatized. I've had travelers who did the Inca Trail, and even after doing the Inca Trail, arrived to Cusco and really felt the altitude there. So, all right. And I suggest about 2 nights in Cusco. If you do really like cities like a slower pace, 3 nights can be nice as well. All right, so then you have the Amazon. Like I said at the beginning, there's 2 different regions really you can look at to go to in the Amazon in Peru. You have the Southern Amazon Basin, which if you have interest in the Amazon, but it's not the driver of your trip, you maybe don't have a lot of time to add on for it or a lot of budget to add on to it, I highly recommend the Southern Amazon Basin. A lot of the wildlife is very similar to what you see in the north. The wildlife there is fantastic as well. The jungle scenery is fantastic as well, but it's just a short, about an hour-long flight from Cusco. 2 to 3 nights. If if the Amazon's a focus of your trip, then you could do more. Most travelers, I would say, just do 2 to 3 nights. Reserva Amazonica is one of my favorite lodges there and has great rates. So you can add on a 2-night all-inclusive program for about $500 or so. So it's not that expensive of an add-on to a trip and just a short flight. The flight doesn't generally add on that much as well. So we have a lot of people that go there that maybe even weren't originally thinking the Amazon, but it's a great opportunity to be able to go without adding much cost or time onto your trip. If you do, like I said, you can do 2 nights. If you do have 3 nights, I lean a little bit more towards 3 nights. 2 nights gives you 1 full day in the jungle, whereas 3 nights would give you 2 full days to do different excursions there. Otherwise, if you really want to go to the Amazon River or the Amazon is more of the focus of your trip, consider going up to Iquitos. There's some great cruises there. I like the Delphine cruises. Aqua and Aria also do a great job. Those are more expensive luxury options. You're looking at more $800 or more per night for those cruises. There is a great lodge there as well called Treehouse, but it's a much more rustic experience. It truly is these tree houses where you're staying at these tree houses in the jungle. But that's really appealing for some, and it's a really cool lodge. So you could check out Treehouse out of Iquitos as well. All right. Lake Titicaca is another option for a great extension to your Peru trip, whereas the Amazon is an extension that gives you an entirely different scenery than what you've seen so far, and it's more focused on nature and wildlife. Extending your trip to Lake Titicaca is somewhat similar scenery, but it's very much a cultural extension. Lake Titicaca is where there are these communities that truly are still living on these floating islands that they've made out of reeds from the lake that you can see here. My biggest recommendation for a trip to Lake Titicaca is there's the town of Puno, and I suggest staying outside of that town, further out onto the peninsula or different areas of the lake outside of the town. Just off the shores of their town, there are the Uros floating islands, which is a group of large islands. And those are, I will say, I've talked to some people who have been to Lake Titicaca and found the experience very touristy. if you stay 2 nights in Puno and just go to the Oros floating islands, you will have that experience of it seeming very touristy. Those islands that most people aren't actually kind of living on those islands anymore. It is pretty much there for the tourists. I suggest going further out onto the lake. We work with some communities on the Titinos floating islands where they truly are still living on those islands, making their living off of fishing, and just receive kind of a few groups of tourists a week as opposed to many, many groups a day. And then I also suggest going further out to the lake and going to Tequila Island, which is really like a step back in time. There's no electricity on that island. Really interesting history and cultures there as well. And if you really want to kind of step out of your comfort zone and jump into the culture, you can do a homestay there as well, which is a really cool experience. So if you're interested in culture, want to add more of that onto your trip, then I would suggest a trip to Lake Titicaca, 2 to 3 nights. You can do some great kayaking here. So if you're interested in kayaking, to have time for that, plus the other things I mentioned, I suggest more 3 nights. If you're interested in luxury accommodations, I highly suggest the Lodge Titilaca. It's a great luxury lodge and they do a great job with some more off the beaten path excursions. All right, and then you have Arequipa and the Colca Canyon. One thing about this destination and circling back to Lake Titicaca, the Amazon can be pre or post that Machu Picchu portion of your trip. Lake Titicaca and Arequipa and the Colca Canyon, those are best done post Machu Picchu, Sacred Valley, Cusco, because they're high altitude. They're higher than Cusco. So Lake Titicaca is at about, this is 13,000 feet. Arequipa isn't as high, but the Colca Canyon is very high. It's about 13,000 feet, about, I believe, as well. So it's better once you've already had that time in Cusco and you've had a week or more acclimatizing to then add on these destinations. Arequipa it's similar to Cusco. It's this really beautiful colonial city. But it gets less tourism, which is neat about it as well. It's called the White City because of the stone that all the buildings were made from. A lot of them are this kind of white stone. So it's a beautiful city, great food as well. And then about 4 hours or so from Arequipa, you have the Colca Canyon. So I suggest staying a few nights in the Colca Canyon, generally about 2 or so, and then a night or 2 in Arequipa, combining those 2 together. The Colca Canyon is where you can go to see the condors. It's a huge canyon. It's one of the world's deepest canyons, and there's a lot of Andean condors there. And as the sun kind of hits the canyon, the condors start to fly and kind of surf almost the heat waves up, and you can see them really close up. So if you have interest in seeing condors, it's also just some great scenery. You can do hiking there as well. There's hot springs. It's a neat add-on to a trip as well. All right, so now I'm just going to kind of run through some different photos to show you some of the different things I've talked about. So here is Sacsay Woman. Sacsay Woman, I think the stonework at Sacsay Woman is even more impressive than the stonework at Machu Picchu. You have just these giant stones that are taller than you are, and they're so close together you can't even slide a piece of paper between the stones. Really incredible site. And it's right outside of Cusco. So that day I mentioned where you fly into Cusco and I had suggested heading straight down to the Sacred Valley, that's a great day to do Sacsay Woman on your way to the Sacred Valley. It is higher than Cusco, but as you can see, it's mostly a flat site. You don't have as many stairs to climb up to explore as you do at a lot of sites. So it works well while you're acclimatizing that day too. All right. So this is kind of some of what you'll see in the Sacred Valley. Some of the towns there. Mountain biking. So we'll discuss a little bit of the weather, but the biggest thing in Peru is the dry season versus the wet season. You don't get a ton of temperature variation. You do get some of it. Our summer, so kind of June, July, August is the cooler time there. It's when you can get temperatures that drop below the 30s. Whereas, you know, in January, February, March, it's more high 30s, low 40s. So again, it's not huge highs, generally 60s, 70s, kind of year round, high 60s. But you do get a wet and a dry season. So this photo you can see, and this photo were both taken during the dry season. So the rainy season is from about November through March and the beginning of April. So if you travel during the rainy season or at the end and right after rainy season, everything is lush and green. Then starting kind of late May, June, it starts to dry out. And as you get more into July, August, September, October, before the rains start, things are more dry. And I'll show some more photos and kind of point out what you can see the difference at some sites. And then with going to Peru in the rainy season, one important thing to point out is it's not like where it rains all day, every day, and you shouldn't travel then. I actually really enjoy the rainy season because everything's lush and green. There's less travelers there. Flowers are in bloom. You generally get rain a few days of your trip. It's generally not all day. It'll be a few hours. Pack your rain gear, but something to be aware of. So that's biking, great biking in the Sacred Valley. This is kayaking in the Sacred Valley as well on Lake Piurai. This is a Pachamanca, which is a really cool experience you can do, especially in the Sacred Valley. It's where they dig a hole in the ground, heat hot stones for hours, then take the stones off, put food in, and then cover the food back with the stones. They basically make an oven in the ground, and it's a traditional celebratory feast, and the food is absolutely amazing. So there's a few, Lake Piurai is one of the spots where we do Pachamancas, or there's a few different spots you can do them in the Sacred Valley. So this is a very similar area as that photo I showed before that was dry. This photo was taken early April, so it's right after that rainy season. You do get rain kind of anytime in April you can get rain, but especially that first half of April you do. So this is how you can see the difference with the rainy season. This is Maras, another really cool site in the Sacred Valley. Maras there's a town Maras, and then below it are the Maras salt pans. And this photo doesn't show it, but it's actually thousands of salt pans that kind of tumble down the mountainside. And there are these man-made salt pans where you have this tiny, very salty stream that flows down. The water flows into the salt pans. As the water evaporates, they then harvest the salt from the salt pans. And what's really cool about the site is it's still very traditional the way they harvest the salt, in that each kind of salt pan belongs to a specific family from the Maras community, and they're responsible for harvesting the salt. They get the profit from now the salt being sent all over the world. But it's a really cool site. It's beautiful and just fascinating. And again, this photo doesn't really show it, but off to the left, you kind of, where that guy was standing, if you looked up, you just have beautiful views of mountains as well. This is Morai. It works well on a day doing Maras and Morai together. These are these large circular agricultural terraces where they basically think the Incans discovered the effects of growing crops at different altitudes. That's Jordan and Tara Harvey. They're the founders of Nomad. So this is, like I said, the Sacred Valley is also a great spot for really diving into the indigenous cultures of Peru. We work closely with a community called the Amaru community. We work really hard to build a close relationship to them. We do a visit where it's nothing like kind of this roadside stop where you get out, take your photos and leave. It's not that at all. Really spend the full morning with the community, learning about their lifestyle, learning about their farming practices and their weaving practices. They show you the plants they harvest and how they take those plants and turn them into beautiful dyes that then they make the yarn and make these beautiful weavings, and you see the whole process of that. If you're interested in getting to know the cultures there, it's a great day. So there you can see weaving. You'll see people weaving all over the Sacred Valley. One cool thing about Peru is you can often tell a lot by someone, whether they're married, whether they're single, what community they're part of, just by the hat they're wearing. So again, some of the plants that then become these dyes and weavings. More of the beautiful clothing they make. This is quinoa, which you'll see all over Peru. Driving through the Sacred Valley, you'll also see this driving through the Sacred Valley all over. It's cuy, or guinea pig, which is a delicacy in Peru. You can just get it in the Sacred Valley, or a lot of restaurants in the Sacred Valley, Machu Picchu, Cusco have cuy on the menu as well. Some more just shots of in the Sacred Valley. These are 2 different hotels in the Sacred Valley. Again, this is dry season, you can see different. This is a picnic we've set up there. So these are 2 very similar sites. They're kind of in that area between Mares and Moray. Rainy season, this was in March, and dry season, I believe that was October. Horseback riding. This is the Pisac Market. If you like shopping, the Pisac Market's a great spot as well. You know, like, I don't know when people are considering traveling, but if you are considering trips coming up soon, the Pisac Market is closed right now. So with all these sites, we're kind of talking general terms right now. Pisac Market is closed. All right, so Ollantaytambo, this is the town I mentioned that's kind of the end of the Sacred Valley and where you can then take the train to Aguascalientes right below Machu Picchu. This is the ruins that are in Ollantaytambo, the Ollantaytambo ruins. So we talked about the Inca Trail. There's also a lot of other treks that you can do. In Peru, this is the Salcantay trek. Salcantay is one of the most common alternative treks. It's often referred to as the back door to Machu Picchu. You don't hike into Machu Picchu. That's one clarification I always like to make. You hike down to a spot where then you meet the train that then will take you back to Aguascalientes. But there is a spot on the trek where you can kind of see Machu Picchu from kind of the backside of it. So that's cool. And it's generally for fewer travelers. If you want to do a multi-day trek, but you don't like camping, you can Salcantay also, that's where Mountain Lodges of Peru has lodges all along the trek that you can do. It is high altitude. It's higher than the Inca Trail. You're getting up to about 15,000 feet. But that's why you have kind of some of this more high alpine scenery. So these are some photos of Salcantay. I don't have photos of it, but the other alternative trek you can do is Choqquequirao. That's a difficult trek as well. All of these multi-day ones are difficult. Choqquequirao takes you to the Choqquequirao ruins. They are eventually building a cable car there. So soon's the time to go if you want to do a trip to Choqquequirao before it gets more visitors like Machu Picchu. But right now it just gets a small handful of visitors every day because you have to do the trek to get there. So if you really want a more off the beaten path trek, like the idea of kind of hiking to some little visited ruins, you kind of feel like Indiana Jones, Choqquequirao is another good one to look at. This one here again is Salcantay. All of these photos here, kind of sample of what meals look like that we do on all the different treks. Just some more kind of scenery. So this is back to some photos of the Inca Trail. This is the ruins that we set up camp right below this site for your first day of camping. This is what, when it's Peruvian flat, what a lot of the Inca Trail looks like. You're hiking on this stone, and then there is a lot of up and down stairs. I highly, even if you don't generally hike with hiking poles, I highly recommend hiking poles for the Inca Trail. I needed them more for the downhill than I did with the up. Those stairs can be really hard on your knees. So like I said, even if you don't hike with hiking poles, I really recommend them for the Inca Trail. You can't have metal tips, you need rubber tips or kind of tip protectors. If going with us, we can provide hiking poles as well. So some more of that Inca Trail. This is hiking up to that Dead Woman's Pass. Coca leaves are very common in Peru to help with the altitude. You'll see coca leaves at your hotel for making tea. A lot of the porters and guides will have them on the Inca Trail. They chew on them to help with the altitude. You can as well. It's very common there. This is my sister and I when we hiked the Inca Trail. That's at the top, that highest point just below 14,000 feet at Dead Woman's Pass. This is that first campsite. This is our second campsite we use. Again, that first and second night, generally the only ones there. There may be one other group, but there really aren't as many travelers there, which is nice. Beautiful campsites. This again is Salcantay. More just kind of photos there. So one important thing to note differences between those treks is on the Inca Trail, there aren't llamas allowed, there aren't horses, there aren't donkeys. So everything is carried by porters. You'll be responsible for carrying your own day pack. And always, if not going with us, check what the company you're going with does. But generally you're carrying your own day pack, and then the porters carry everything else. The porters are amazing at what they do. It's amazing what they accomplish. You'll be hiking on the trail and you'll hear them coming behind you if you get a sign, they almost just run past you. They're really incredible. On Salcantay and Choqquequirao, on those treks, horses, donkeys, llamas are allowed, which if you really want to do a trek, but you're really unsure how you're going to do with it, that can be a consideration with Salcantay and Choqquequirao. We call it an emergency horse, where if someone's really having a difficult time, they can jump on the horse for a while. You don't have that option on the Inca Trail. Once you're going, you really have to keep going. Certainly I've seen guides help people through, but you don't have that option to jump on a horse like you do with Salcantay and Choqquequirao if you're having a hard time. Some more of the scenery. This is Aguascalientes, also referred to as Machu Picchu Pueblo, the town below Machu Picchu. Some of those famous photos of Machu Picchu. This is my husband and I at the site. One thing to know, especially if you're going during the rainy season or even through May, I've had travelers have this in May, Machu Picchu's in the cloud forest. So even actually outside that season, you get clouds all year long. And that's why if you have the time for it, we often if you're doing the Inca Trail, you'll arrive in the afternoon, have that opportunity to see the site and then back up the next day. If you're not doing the Inca Trail, I suggest morning permits and afternoon permits, whether those are 2 different days. You have afternoon one day, stay the night, and then morning permits the next, just in case you have a cloudy day. I have seen clouds cover this mountain for several hours. So that'll give you 2 time slots in case it's a really cloudy morning, then more time for the clouds to clear. Generally Machu Picchu is sold with morning permits and afternoon permits, so you can purchase those two different permit slots. But Machu Picchu is in the cloud forest. More sites of Machu Picchu. Here you can see the road, the switchback kind of road that takes you up to Machu Picchu. This hotel, I get a lot of questions about it. This is the only hotel that is right outside the site. It's called the Sanctuary Lodge. It is generally more than $1,000 a night. It is a very expensive hotel, and they're not allowed to do much really remodeling of the hotel because of their location. They can't do much construction. So it isn't what people would expect of a hotel where they're paying $1,000 a night. You very much are paying for the location, and it's in the parking lot where the buses arrive, and the buses are there turning around all day. So for most people, we don't suggest that hotel. There are a lot nicer hotels in the town right below Machu Picchu. It doesn't give you special access to the site in terms of being able to get in earlier or later. The site closes and opens and closes at the same time every day for everyone, whether you're staying at the Sanctuary Lodge or not. And then you cannot see Machu Picchu actually from your rooms. Those are a few common misconceptions I have with that hotel that I want people to know before they consider it. Having said that, you do have to wait in a line to take the bus up and wait in a line to take the bus down. It is nice to not have to do that, to be able to wake up, have breakfast, and then walk out, get in line to enter Machu Picchu and get in. That is nice. So it's something to consider, but I just want people to know and understand what it is when they're looking at the Sanctuary Lodge Hotel. For towns in town, I really like Machu Picchu Pueblo Hotel for a nicer 5-star experience. El Mapi is the same company, Inca Terra. They also have the lodge in the Amazon that I like. El Mapi is a great 4-star option too. And sorry, circling back to this photo is taken from Huayna Picchu. So that hike where you can climb up to this peak, the view from there is where this photo was taken. The other hike, Cerro Machu Picchu, is climbing up to the peak up above here. So you also get a bird's eye view. That is not as steep of a hike. So if you're afraid of heights, but you want to do a hike within the site, aside from just, all the general walking around the site you'll do, Cerro Machu Picchu is a good option. Right. Some of the, I believe these are vicuñas, I could be wrong, but there's lots of different camelid species there. More of Machu Picchu and the stonework there, which is incredible. Again, that's Taryn Jordan, Nomads founders. Lots of, especially going in rainy season and right after rainy season, you have some orchids. Here again is another Pachamanca. These two photos, this photo is actually the Caca the rock bird, and that's just taken at that Machu Picchu Pueblo Hotel. Cusco, the market in Cusco, there's a great food market there if you like kind of exploring food markets, the San Pedro market. This is Puno, the town I would suggest not staying in on Lake Titicaca, staying outside of that town. This is on Tequila Island where no electricity, really kind of a step back in time, and you can kayak to that island. We do a cool day kayaking along the shores and then crossing over to Tequila Island. The boats and islands that they make from the reeds out of the lake. More photos of, that's all Tequila Island. This is Siustani. A lot of the ruins that you see in the Lake Titicaca area, those are pre-Incan ruins. So these are Siustani burial towers, and those are pre-Incan. Flying to the southern Amazon basin, this is the Madre de Dios River. So you are on a river, it's just not the Amazon River. Town of Puerto Maldonado, where you fly into, and just some of the scenery that you'll see in the Amazon. This is similar both in the southern Amazon and northern Amazon region, these photos. These are all from the southern, but one of the few kind of species that you will see in the north that you won't see in the south is the pink river dolphin, the pink river dolphin. So if that's important to you, then you need to go to the north. The caimans, you can do a night boat ride in both areas where you go looking for the caimans, which is very cool. The giant river otters, those are more commonly seen in the south, but not guaranteed either spot. I mean, wildlife is never guaranteed, but. Canopy towers, Inca Terra's Reserva Amazonica is the only one that has a canopy walkway system. Beautiful photos of the canopy. You can do piranha fishing at Inca Terra's property. It's an add-on. With the cruises up north, it's generally just a part of the cruise. You can do kayaking as well. These are the kind of casitas at Reserva Amazonica. They have private porches and hammocks. So that's kind of, again, that region of what we've mostly discussed. So whether we kind of already did dive into this, and I don't really like this graph because the average doesn't tell us much, but lows in that kind of June, July, August timeframe, lows can dip below the 30s. This again, I'm talking about the Machu Picchu, well, not as much Machu Picchu, but Sacred Valley and Cusco area can drop below the 30s. Highs generally in the 60s, 70s, especially in that Machu Picchu area. That's where you're in the cloud forest and it's a bit warmer. But the biggest variation you can see is that rainfall. So November through March, first part of April, the last few seasons, I will say it's pushed even further into April, are the rainy months of the year. Going anytime you should be prepared. I've had people get rain on the Inca Trail in June, so you should always be prepared for the rain, but especially if going during that rainy season, pack your rain gear. If you're doing a lot of hiking that includes rain pants, I suggest having them. But you do, if you go during or at the end of that rainy season, get kind of that lush green countryside. Okay, passport. So you need a passport that's good for 6 months beyond your dates of travel, no visa. So immunizations and shots. So generally, you no immunizations are required. I do suggest having Hep A and typhoid if you haven't had those vaccinations. If you're going to the Amazon, then yellow fever is recommended. It's not required, but it is a good idea. So I think this is a good spot to address COVID. Peru it was closed for a very long time. Like everywhere else, they closed their borders in March and have pretty much been closed. Not pretty much, they have been closed since then until recently. They're barely starting to reopen. They slowly added flights. Every country is doing it very differently. Peru added countries that were allowed based on how long the flight was from that country to Peru, but now they have added cities, airports from the US, so the US travelers can go to Peru. What is required is a negative PCR COVID test from within 72 hours. The way that kind of ends up timing out, it generally does mean you would need a COVID test where you can get the results the next day. That's difficult in a lot of places, so travel, and this is a week or two old. It's very much just started opening up. We're still getting more details on it. So travel hasn't really fully resumed, well, like anywhere, but travel hasn't really resumed much in Peru. We're hoping, I bet those restrictions will stay the same for a while. Because of that rainy season, we don't really get a lot of travelers going there until that March, April, May timeframe. We're hoping that travel will be, I think it'll definitely have resumed by then. Whether that 72-hour requirement will be the same or not, it's hard to say. I think it'll honestly depend on a vaccine, which, we don't know. So for those looking to plan new trips, you certainly could. We have a lot of really flexible policies right now for those booking new trips. They book them generally. It depends a little bit on the exact properties and everything involved in the trip, but generally they're booked with policies where you can postpone free of charge. So if you booked a trip for the spring and ended up needing to postpone it to the fall instead, or the following spring, those are our policies right now. Otherwise, most people we have are looking towards next fall for their trips, so fall 2021, or we're even working with a lot of travelers who are starting to plan early for 2022. The Inca Trail is great to plan far in advance, and a lot of just different permits in Peru. It's great to plan far in advance. If you are willing to kind of see how travel is starting to resume and look at a trip for this spring, again, we can't know whether the restrictions will stay the same, but one thing to note on the positive side is how many people are allowed into Machu Picchu has really changed. Usually there's 5,000 permits a day. Right now there's 600, and they are divided into 75 permits per hour. So it's far fewer travelers at Machu Picchu. So it's a unique opportunity in that regard. So kind of something to consider as people weigh the pros and cons of considering traveling right now. Something I'm certainly happy to chat with people more as well. All right, so I want to leave a bit of time for questions too. So I'm going to kind of just scroll through some of these. The currency in Peru is soles. It's about 3 to 1, so $10 is 30 soles, and that's the currency you'll get from ATMs there. They use 220 volt instead of 110 volt like we do in the States. Most hotels do have the same type of plugs that we do. You'll occasionally find one of these. And most devices, a lot of laptop chargers, phone chargers nowadays accept 220 volt. You can see that if you look at your charger. I've traveled in Peru for a whole month once before without ever needing to use an adapter or a converter because all of my devices accepted 220 volt, and every hotel I stayed in had this. And if they don't, generally the front desk will have a converter or an adapter. No, don't drink the water in Peru. So packing for your trip, the biggest thing to keep in mind is layers. The sun is out, it's 60s, 70s, it can get warm quickly, you're close to the equator, but then the clouds cover the sun and suddenly you're putting on 2 new layers. So layers is really key for a trip to Peru. If you're doing the Inca Trail, we send a whole Inca Trail packing list as well. So this I kind of talked through that ideal trip flow. You can see online, like I said, we do all custom trips, but we have some really great sample trips online. So this is one sample that kind of goes through what I talked about. It's Proactive Explorer. So you fly into Lima. You don't actually see much of Lima this day. As I said, you stay at it, you arrive late at night generally. Next day, fly to Cusco, do that sacred, head to Cusco visiting, or sorry, head to the Sacred Valley, visiting those sites on the way. Then a few days in the Sacred Valley, one visit, kind of cultural day, acclimatizing. The next day, a great day visiting Maras and Moray. You can do it by bike, you can do it by horseback ride. Then the Inca Trail Express, hiking that one day to Machu Picchu. Then a full day at Machu Picchu, getting morning time and afternoon time there. And then slowly the next day, Machu Picchu to Cusco, visiting Ollantaytambo and some different sites on the way, and then ending your trip in Cusco. So that's Proactive Explorer. It's one of our sample itineraries online. There's different variations of it. Classic Machu Picchu is that exact same trip flow, but less active. And then you also have our Inca Trail and Beyond trip online. My biggest recommendation when people look at this sample trip is to add another day to acclimatize if you have it. Then we also have sample itineraries for kayaking in Lake Titicaca. We have sample itineraries just for going to that lodge, Reserva Amazonica. So definitely check out our site. It's www.nomadadventures, KNOWMAD adventures.com. And then finally, so this presentation is meant for when we're at the expo and we have a booth and we're physically there. And so at the end of the presentation, we have a bunch of these $200 travel credits. I can't physically give those to you right now, but if anyone is interested in having one of those or interested in traveling with us, what we can do is just email us after this presentation. My email is Renee, RENEE, @nomadadventures.com. You can also email travel@nomadadventures.com. Just look us up on the website. You'll see that email as well. Email us, let us know you attended this presentation, and we'll email you that travel credit. I would say just try and email us within, I would say before the end of November, just because I think this presentation will go up on YouTube and we're not going to be providing it for years to come. So just email us before the end of the month, let us know you attended it, and we'll email you that travel credit. All right, with that, I'm gonna open it up to questions. I think if I can get into the chat, let's see. One moment.
Just a reminder to anyone that wants to ask questions, you can enter them in the chat below where you're watching the video.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so we'll wait a little bit, see if anyone enters any questions into that chat. If you have questions that you don't want to ask there or questions after, you can certainly reach out to me at that email or just go onto our website. There's lots of contact forms and things there. The first step in our planning process always is, yes, thank you. They just sent it on the chat, Renee@nomadadventures.com. So you can always email me there. The first step in our planning process is a quick phone call. So I'm happy to have a call with anyone to start the process of planning. We've planned trips for people leaving in a few weeks. We've started the conversation of planning trips sometimes 4 years in advance. So even if you're just starting the process, thinking about a trip in a few years, happy to chat with you. It's no surprise we don't really have people traveling right now. So we always love still being able to get on the phone and chat travel with people. So don't hesitate to reach out. And yeah, if you have any questions right now, feel free to send them in that chat. You can just hang on here for a little bit. Go back to our.
Thanks for the presentation, Renee. Can you just explain a little about like the process of booking or planning a trip and like what fees Nomad has?
Yeah, good question. Yep. So the first step is just that kind of, we call it a discovery phone call. It's generally 20 minutes to an hour, kind of depending how much there is to discuss. We figure out, how active you want to be. With Peru, I really ask questions on how much you like to hike to kind of decipher, okay, are we doing the train to Machu Picchu? Are we doing one of the Inca Trail options to the Machu Picchu? Is an alternative trek a better fit? Make recommendations on those, answer your questions. So that's kind of the first step. And then the goal is coming off that call that I can send over a skeleton. So then from there, travelers have, and this is all, we don't charge a planning fee. Our process we found is really successful, and most people end up booking a trip after it. So we don't plan any sort of charging fee. So this is all free. Send over a trip skeleton after that call that provides links to the hotels I'm suggesting for you, a brief description of each day. So bike ride Maras and Morai, for example. So you can see how many days we're talking, how often you're moving hotels. We can make sure it's the right fit for you. I provide a ballpark, and it works really well to easily work through changes until we arrive to the best trip for you. And then we develop a full detailed custom proposal. Once we've nailed down that skeleton, you get kind of like what our itineraries look like online, where you have a detailed description of each day, you have your exact trip cost, and then we send over registration forms with that. And so then to book the trip, we generally require a 30% deposit, and then your final payment for Peru generally is due 45 days prior to departure. It depends a little bit on the trip, but nearly all Peru trips are 45 days prior to departure. So you're not paying anything until you then book the trip and pay that deposit.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
It doesn't look like we've had any more questions come in through the chat, so I think we might close out here, and people have your email address if they do have any questions.
Perfect. Sounds good. Well, thank you guys so much for attending, and we have a presentation same time tomorrow on Patagonia, and then same time on Thursday. Patagonia tomorrow, Jordan Harvey, Nomad's founder, is giving that one, and then I'm giving a presentation as well on Thursday about Ecuador and the Galapagos. So if you're interested in any of those destinations, feel free to attend those and enjoy the rest of the expo.
Thanks, Renee.
Yep, thank you. Have a good evening.